So let's get started, right? Let me share the screen with you. So let me tell you what we'll do today. Perfect, great. Okay, so today we'll talk about where we left in the last class, right? So yesterday we started our discussion about the types of we talked about national income statistics, right? And then we talked about different approaches to calculating GDP, right? So we'll do a very quick recap, right? And then move forward from there, right? So let's do a quick recap of what national income is. So we said national income is the total income of all the people who are living in a country, right? So have a look at this. Just a second. Right? So national income is the total income of all people living in the country. Now there are different ways to calculate national income, right? Or you can say there are different statistics used to estimate the national income of a country, right? So one is GDP, which is the most popular one, and you will see GDP is most frequently used to calculate the national income, right? Then there are a few other measures as well, which we discussed yesterday, right? So national income statistics, right? Just a second. So since we have already covered this, so we'll do a quick recap today, and then we'll move on to our today's topic, national income statistics, right? Now, statistics is basically statistic, we say, is a number, it's a value which is used to estimate something, right? So national income statistics, right? So the first method or the first way to calculate national income of a country is known as gross domestic product. What is GDP? Gross domestic product, or GDP, is the total income of people living in a country, right? So in other simple words, you can say that it is the total value of all goods and services produced in a country during certain time period, right? So no matter which company is producing this output, as long as it is produced in a certain country, it would be part of that country's GDP, right? So even if Google is operating in India, Amazon has an office in India, but whatever value of goods and services they produce, that would be part of India's GDP. Why? Because that company is located in India, right? That particular office of Amazon is located in India, right? So that's gross domestic product, total value of all goods and services produced within the borders of that country, right? Then another national income statistic that we discussed yesterday, that is gross national product. Now, gross national product is basically the income of people who belong to a certain country. Gross national product, GNP, as we say, it is the income of people who belong to a certain country, gross national product, right? So what we look at is that, let's say if we are calculating it for GNP of Pakistan, then every Pakistani individual or a company who is operating whether in Pakistan or outside Pakistan, we add up their incomes and that will give us gross national product, right? So gross national product is the income of people who belong to a certain country or certain nationality, right? How do we calculate GNP from GDP, right? So quick recap, gross domestic product plus net factor income from abroad. Now, what is net factor income from abroad? I'll tell you. Net factor income from abroad, and that would give you your GNP. That would be your gross national product, right? Okay, now think about it. What is net factor income from abroad, right? So income that your nationals are earning overseas minus income that foreigners are earning in your country, right? So how will we convert GDP into GNP? We will add net factor income from abroad in the GDP of a country to calculate net factor income from abroad is basically the income that your country's nationals are earning while living abroad, income earned by your nationals living abroad, right? Minus income earned by foreigners living in your country, right? So that is basically net factor income from abroad. Income earned by your nationals living abroad minus income earned by foreigners living in your country. Income earned by foreigners living in your country. Is this making sense? Right? Breathe. Okay. Now the idea is, when will a country's living in your country, living in your country. Okay. Now, when will a country's GDP be higher than its GNP? Now, let me ask you a trick question, right? So that you can fully understand the difference between GDP and GNP, right? So my question is, when will a country's GDP be higher than its GNP? So when your nationals are earning less, when your nationals are earning less abroad and foreigners are earning more in your country, then that would mean that your GDP would be higher than your GNP, right? Does it make sense? Right? Because less income is coming from your nationals who are working abroad compared to what foreigners are earning in your country, right? So this is most of the times the case for developed countries. Are you following this? Right? For developed countries, the idea is that since not a lot of people go outside of developed countries, and even if they do, they will not be earning as much as they could have earned in their own countries, right? So that's why their GDP, developed countries' GDP is higher than their GNP, because their nationals are not earning a lot in foreign countries compared to what foreigners are earning in their country, right? GDP is greater than GNP. Does it make sense? Is everything making sense here? On the other hand, for developing countries, it's quite the opposite, because a lot of people go out of developing countries to work in other developed countries, and therefore their nationals are earning more abroad compared to what foreigners are earning in their country. For developing countries, more income is being earned by their nationals who are working abroad compared to what foreigners are earning in their country, right? So in this case, the GDP of developing countries would be less than the GNP, gross national product, right? Make sense? Okay. Now, knowing the difference between GDP and GNP, then we said that we in fact did talk about two more measures of national income statistics. One was net domestic product and the other one was net national product. Now, what is net domestic product? So you just subtract depreciation from gross domestic product and that will give you net domestic product, right? So NDP, net domestic product, is gross domestic product minus depreciation, right? And then the fourth and the last one is net national product. So when you subtract depreciation from net national product, when you subtract net national product, when you subtract depreciation from net national product, you get, gross national product, you get net national product. And I did tell you, why do we subtract depreciation? Because net measures are more realistic estimate. How are they more realistic estimate? Because we did talk about this, that depreciation is the amount of money that has to be spent, right, on replacing the worn out assets, right? So what is depreciation? Depreciation is the wear and tear of assets. So net measures are more, more realistic estimate of the value of goods and services produced by a country. Why? Because, have a look at this, because it excludes the wear and tear of assets that took place during the time, as this money will eventually be spent to replace the worn out assets, right? So that is why net measures are more realistic compared to a better estimate, you can say, of national income as compared to gross measures. Okay, then quick recap of the three methods used to calculate GDP. So there's income approach, there's expenditure approach, and there's product approach, right? Now, income approach estimates the GDP by adding up the income of all the people who are living in a country. How a country does that? It's basically when these people file their income tax return, that gives the government estimate of how much each individual is earning in their country. So that is how you calculate GDP using income approach. Then for the expenditure approach, you add up the income of all the people, you add up the expenditure of all the people during a certain time period to find out the GDP. How does the government do that? All businesses have to file their sales tax, right? Sales tax is basically on the production. right? On the sale when something is being sold. So when companies file their sales tax, that is how the government get to find out how much was the expenditure in the country during certain time period. And then the third and the last method to calculate GDP is product approach. What is product approach? You find the value added. What is value added? It's the difference between selling price and the cost of components, right? So value added is selling price minus cost of components. That is also a way to calculate the GDP of a country, right? Okay, now this being said, Preet, now we are about to start a new topic, right? Which is known as growth versus development. Now, this is another very important topic of A2 economics, and you will see when you that every year there is an essay question related to this. Every year in the past paper, there is an essay question related to this. Now, what is growth? What is development? We'll talk about it in a lot of detail, right? Okay. Now, you must have heard the word growth. This country is growing very fast. Growth of Pakistan or India was this much last year, and it will be this much this year, and so on and so forth, right? Now, what do we mean when we say, what do we mean when we say growth, right? Let me write down this. Growth is the percentage change in a country's GDP on a year by year basis, right? So most of the times we calculate the growth of a country on annual basis, but that is not always true, right? So most of the times we are calculating the growth of a country on annual basis, but sometimes we can also do it on quarterly basis. Sometimes we can also do it on monthly basis, and so on and so forth, right? So not bi-monthly, bi-annual, right? Bi-monthly doesn't make sense, right? So this is what we are, this is what the growth is. Now, how do we calculate a growth? Let's have a quick idea of how we calculate growth. Now, think about this. The growth is simply the percentage change in the country's GDP, right? So think about this. If a country last year was, let's say, 2020, right? So 2021 has just ended, right? So how much was the total GDP of a country? What was the total value of all goods and services produced in a country between 1st Jan to 31st December last year? And similarly, what was this value this year, right? So have a look at this. So between 2020, right? So what was the value? What was the GDP of a country in 2020 compared to what is the GDP in 2021? That will give you the country's growth rate, right? When we calculate the percentage change. Let me do an example for you so that you get a better idea of how we calculate this, right? So let's say last year, between this time period, the country had production of total value of goods and services produced in that country was equals to $5 billion, right? Now this year it was $600 billion, right? $1 billion worth of goods and services produced in that country this year, right? Now, what you have to do, you simply need to calculate the percentage change. How do we calculate the percentage change? New value, which is the new GDP, minus old value, which is 500 divided by 500 into 100. New minus old divided by old into 100, right? So that will give you 1/100. It will give you 20%. So this means that the country has grown by 20% during this 1 year. Between 2020 to 2021, the country grew by 20%, right? So the increase in its GDP was 20%, right? So that's the simple definition, and that's the simplest way to calculate the GDP of a country. Percentage change in country's GDP on a year by year basis, right? Just to be more specific, could also be calculated for a quarter. Quarter is 3 months, or by, right? So it's not just that we calculate the growth on annual basis. It could also be either on quarterly basis or on biannually basis, but most of the times it's on a year by year basis, right? So that's what the growth is. Now, what is the significance of growth? Why is of an economy important? Knowing what the GDP is. Now, Now, knowing what the GDP is, can you please tell me that why is growth important for an economy? So why is it important that an economy keeps growing? And what benefit it provides? Yeah. Why is growth of an economy important? Okay, so let me tell you why is growth of an economy important, right? So GDP being the national of a country shows much country's nationals collectively certain time period, and therefore an increase shows increase in citizens' income, right? So the first thing that we have explained here is that since GDP is the total income of all the people who are living in a country, right, which is basically the citizens' income of a country, when there is growth taking place, this means that the national income of that country has increased between any two period, right? When that happens, it means that the citizens' income have increased. Now, with this higher income, what can they do, right? So with higher incomes, these people can afford better quality products, goods and services, which will eventually increase their living standards, right? This is simple, right? So that's the idea. Why is GDP growth rate, or simply as we say, growth of an economy important? Because that means that the national income is increasing. When that happens, it means that the citizens' incomes have increased, with which they can buy more goods and services, they can buy better quality goods and services, and they are becoming better off, right? Okay. Now, that being said, but here's the challenge. Is sometimes we say economic growth, sometimes we say GDP growth, sometimes we simply say growth. But do remember that all these terms refer to the same point, that the GDP is growing, national income is growing, right? All three terms mean the same thing. Right? So let me write all three terms in case you ever feel confused about these, right? Is economic growth or GDP growth always beneficial? Now, this is something that we have to understand, right? Because this is exactly the topic that we're about to discuss, that why is growth of an economy important? And then we will compare it that what's the difference between growth and development? I'm sure you must have also heard the word development again and again, right? And it's not a word that you hear only in economics. I mean, growth word is often used in a lot of other subjects as well, right? So we will obviously talk about that. But for now, what we're looking at is growth always beneficial, right? We do know it's beneficial because that means higher incomes, and with higher incomes, people can buy more goods and services. They can buy better quality goods and services and all that stuff. But is growth always beneficial? Okay, think about this. No, because its own disadvantages. Now think about this. So the answer to the question, that is economic growth always beneficial, is that no, because economic growth comes with its own disadvantages. Now, what are the disadvantages? What are the challenges that economic growth brings to an economy, or brings to a country? That is what we're about to explore, right? Okay. Now, what are all the challenges that it brings, right? First of all, are you getting where are we going with this? Is it making sense? Okay, now let me give you an overview one more time, right? So that we are all on the same page. Now, growth of a country is basically, simply speaking, the increase in its GDP. Now, what is GDP? The total value of goods and services produced in a country, right? Now, when GDP is growing or there's economic growth that is taking place, right? It means that the citizens of that country are now earning more than what they used to earn, right? So if a person XYZ was earning 50,000 rupees before, now with more economic growth, most probably that person will be earning something more than 50,000. So with higher incomes, that person can buy more goods, can buy better quality goods, right? Can afford things that he or she was not previously able to afford. So obviously all these things bring improvement in the living standards, better education, better healthcare, more goods, more convenience, more luxury. That's recommended and that's beneficial. But not but that's not always advantageous, or in other words, growth comes with its own challenges. Now, what are its challenges, what are its disadvantages? That's what we're about to look at. So first of all, right, first of all, resource, the expense of resource depletion, right? Now, you might have heard this word before. If you haven't, I can explain you, right? What is resource depletion, right? So there are so many non-renewable resources that a country is using, right? So all the natural resources that a country uses, like oil, coal, wood, right? Wood is not technically non-renewable resource, but if you use wood at a very fast pace, then there could be a time when the country gets to deplete its wood resources, its forest and things like that, right? Now, that being said, economic growth comes at the expense of resource depletion, right? So what is resource depletion? Resource depletion is when stock of non-resources are exhausted, right? So when the pool of non-renewable resources are close to being exhausted, that is what resource depletion is, right? So that's one big disadvantage. And why would that happen? Because just imagine, if you're producing more goods and services, then you will need more space, which means that you will need to set up more factories. So in every part of the country, you will see more factories, more roads being constructed, more infrastructure like railway network, or things like that, airports and things like that, right? So all these things take a lot of space. When that happens, natural beauty would be affected, right? And then you can also get rid of the natural forest that were there and things like that, right? And with that also comes in wildlife extension, right? Extinction. So that's another challenge that we face, right? It also brings wildlife extinction. Okay. Then another problem with the GDP growth rate is working hours of labor, which can stress and anxiety for individuals, right? So this is another thing that has been recorded and that has been researched about, that when countries grow at a very fast pace, when they're producing more goods and services, then that requires people or the citizens of that country to produce more, to work longer hours, to be more productive, and they're always working and they have to put in long hours. And when they do that, obviously that brings a lot of anxiety and depression and things like that, right? And with that happening, might contribute to issues, right? So think about it. If people are falling sick, or if people are, using drugs and medical drugs and all that stuff, because of things like, being working more and all that stuff, right? Then that would mean, right? That would mean that it can contribute to more healthcare issues. Is this making sense? Okay. Now, this being said, let's move forward and let's talk about other disadvantages of growth, right? Uh, okay. So we have talked about resource depletion so far. We have talked about long hours. Preet, is this making sense? Then, not always is beneficial for all citizens. Right? Now, what do I mean when I say that not always GDP growth is equally beneficial for all citizens of a country? That simply means that there is more unequal income distribution, right? Research has been made how over time the income distribution over time, the world income distribution has become more unequal. Now think about this. Most of the times what is happening that even though a country is growing, let's take China's example, let's take India's example, let's take Pakistan's example, right? So I mean, these countries are growing, but not always the common people or the, you know, the normal individuals, the normal citizens are benefiting from that growth, because it's only those big corporations and those big businesses that get to create more wealth, right? So Tata is a big group in India, one example that I can think of, right? So I mean, it's great that Tata is making more factories, Tata is, you know, entering new industries and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, the wealth is being accumulated by few individuals, a few, you know, few strong families who own Tata, right? By now, it might be a public company. I'm not sure if Tata is a public company, because if it's a public company, then I mean, it's good. Right. Under the guidance. Right. So it's not a public company yet. It's not a public company yet, which means that the owners of the shares of the company are still held by few people in that company, right? Like it's privately held, right? But coming back to the point, when companies grow to a large extent, then obviously they can also become public, which means that the general public can buy their shares just like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and all that stuff. But then if some companies are private, then there is even more unequal wealth distribution. Same goes for India and same goes for China and Pakistan. That oftentimes the investment that is being made and the growth that is taking place in a country, that is only benefiting few people, few families, few businesses, rather than, you know, more equal, and all that stuff. And when that happens, right, when income and wealth distribution becomes more unfair, government has to use different strategies, income distribution, right? And obviously, unequal income distribution comes with its own challenges, like, you know, higher crime rates, more social injustice, right? Because we do know all these things happen if there is very unequal income distribution. So I mean, those are some of the problems that GDP brings, right? Then other things that you need to know about that. For all positives and negatives. Right? Now, this is a very important point, and I would want you to fully understand this concept that GDP also does not account for all economic positives and negatives. Now, what do we mean when we say economic positives and negatives, right? So the idea is fairly simple, right? That there are a lot of things that are having a positive effect on the living standards or the quality of life for people in a country, but those things are not accounted for in the GDP, right? So simplest example I can give you for now, GDP does not tell how much value of, you know, how much value of um, tell the distribution of goods and services that would be used by a country. Now have a look at this. Um, spend of its versus producing military goods, right? That increase its GDP, but these projects in reality not have a positive effect on the living standards of the country's citizens. Living standards citizens, right? Is it making sense, right? So another problem with the GDP is, now think about this. So GDP is just a number that tells you the total value of goods and services that were produced in a country during certain time period. But what if a country's GDP is increasing because it's spending more resources on producing weapons, it's producing more of, military goods, whereas, it should have spent more money on education and healthcare. Now, education and healthcare will increase the development or the living standards of country's citizens, because obviously these are the products that directly affect the quality of life in a country. But if the money is, on the other hand, spent more on products like defense and military goods, then that's a problem, right? So due to all these reasons, right, we do have reasons to believe that economic growth rate is not always beneficial, or we can also say that economic growth rate is not always showing us the accurate picture, right? When that happens, then what is it that we have to look at, right? So when growth is not showing us a very accurate picture, then what is it that we should look at? And that is known as development. So that is known as development, and that is what takes us to the next thing, that what is development and why is it important for us to measure development. To measure development. So sometimes you will hear the word economic development, sometimes you will just hear the word development, but I mean, it's kind of means the same, right? Okay. Now, what is development and why is it important for us to measure development? So let me tell you, development is an estimate how high are the living standards of a country's citizens, right? So how much developed a country is, you must have always, in fact, we always hear the term that this country is more developed, this country is less developed. Now, what do we mean by that? That we are looking at the living standards of a country's citizens, that whether it has high living standards, low living standards, and we need to know what factors affect living standards, right? What factors or traits or characteristics affect the living standards of citizens in a country, right? Now, building on this, there are factors, say variables, that affect a country's living standards. For instance, quality of education, quality of healthcare, availability of economic opportunities like jobs, or to start a business, access to capital, right? Other things like law and order situation, availability of food, housing, right? Etc., etc., right? So the list goes on and it goes on, right? Okay, now let's look at this one more time. Now, after we have talked about that what is growth, and after we have talked about that how growth or GDP is not always beneficial for a country because of different reasons, that higher growth will result in resource depletion, we talked about that. Then more growth requires longer working hours of labor, which means that they will feel more anxiety and more stress. GDP is not always equally distributed, right? So the income that a country generates through higher GDP is not always equally distributed between all the citizens, and that results in more unequal income distribution, right? So that's another challenge of GDP. And the last thing that we discussed as the disadvantage of GDP is that GDP doesn't account for all economic goods and bads, right? Economic goods or economic bads, or positives or negatives, as you can say, because GDP doesn't tell you that how much of a certain type of product was made, right? It only tells you the total value of the goods and services that were produced. It doesn't tell you that, whether this money was spent on producing weapons or whether this money was spent on producing, goods like education and healthcare, right? Now, after we have discussed this, now we have moved forward and we are talking about development, right? Now, what is development? It is basically the living standards of the citizens living in a country, right? Now, how do we measure living standards? There are many factors and variables that affect a country's living standards, right? For instance, the quality of education and healthcare that's available to a country's citizens, availability of economic opportunities like jobs and business opportunities, access to capital, whether they can start their own business, do they have access to finance or not, and other things like law and order situation, availability of food, housing, etc., etc. Right? So another thing that you need to know, that economists have developed special, right? So over time, economists have developed special, you can say, indicators that estimate or calculate the development of a country, right? Now, that is what we're about to look at next. That, think about this. By hearing the definition of development, you must have guessed that development is very, subjective thing, right? So it's often possible that a country like Pakistan, otherwise it's a developing country, but someone in Pakistan might be earning very high income compared to someone who's living in USA, which is very developed, right? So, I mean, it's not always the case that if we think of a country, because usually countries are huge and there are so many people and so much of population for a country, that every person would have the same standard of living. Obviously, some people are earning more, they have more resources, they have higher income, so they have better living standards, and others have lower living standards. But we need to at least get an idea, at least we need to get an idea that on average, whether the living standards of that country are high or low, right? And that is why these economists have developed indicators that estimate that thing, right? Okay, now think about this. Now, what are some of the most popular tools are as follows, right? So think about this. What are some of the tools, or you can say methods or indicators used to measure development of a country are as follows. So the first one that we talk about, which is part of our syllabus, is known as Human Development Index, right? And the short form for that is HDI, right? Then another thing that we'll talk about is Human Poverty Index. There is another word for it as well, right? So Human Poverty Index, which is nowadays known as multidimensional. So these are the same thing, but I mean two different words to mean the same thing, right? So back in the day, it was known as Human Poverty Index. Now it's known as multidimensional poverty index, right? Okay. This being said, then there's one more and that is known as measure of economic welfare, MEW, right? Measure of economic welfare. So these are the three methods that we talk about for development, and we'll discuss in detail that what each of these methods show us and all that, right? So Preet, do you want to continue the class? Right. So just rejoin with the same link. just rejoin with the same link, right? I'm ending the class. Right. Okay. Yeah, sure.